Okay, so in order to discuss flight testing of the spin and the development of instrumentation and sensors with particular regards to airborne studies of the spin, we're going to go way back and discuss the very first documented studies of the spin. So, of course, since aircraft were first invented, the aerodynamic conditions necessary to initiate a spin, of course, were apparent. It's just physics. But in those very early days, the flying was taking place just several feet above the ground in most cases, and therefore the characteristics of the spin were not allowed to develop and therefore weren't identified as such, right? They weren't flying high enough in order to enter a fully developed spin, so therefore it wasn't recognized. But as soon as aircraft were able to fly at a much higher altitude, then people started to recognize this aerodynamic feature called the spin. So, of course, previous to this, the aerodynamic features leading to a stall and therefore a reduction in lift were well understood. So the Wright brothers famously approximated that 90% of all fatal aircraft accidents in those early days were attributed to stalling. So it was well understood that if you exceed a critical angle of attack, the wing stalls and you get a reduction in lift. But that wasn't allowed to develop into a spin because aircraft weren't flying high enough. So the British Advisory Committee for Aeronautics first documented the dangers of spinning in the first annual report of the committee in 1910. And the first person who was documented to recover from a spin was F.P. Raynham, who found himself in a spin near Brooklands Aerodrome in the south of England. But critically, his spin was not observed by onlookers, and he himself wasn't in fact sure on how he'd managed to recover from it. That was in 1911. The first recovery from a spin that was both observed and with feedback from the pilot in order to document how he managed to achieve successful recovery from a spin was Wilfred Park, a lieutenant in the Royal Navy. This was at Larkhill Air Force Base in England, and he attributed his recovery to what became known as Park's dive, a technique still used to this day, right? So oppose the spin and then push forward on the stick to reduce the angle of attack and enter a dive to recover the airspeed. So that was attributed to Wilfred Park. He was a very experienced pilot, very early pioneer of flying techniques, and he was a very young man still at this time, I think 22 or 23 years old, and was unfortunately killed a few months later in a Handley Page aircraft with the boss of Handley Page, who was also killed in an incident on the 15th of December 1912, just a few months after his recovery from the spin, when he crashed in Wembley near London, and this was due to a loss of engine power, I think, in his Handley Page monoplane. So a very tragic end to a very fitting pioneer of all things aviation in those early days. Shortly after that, the first deliberate spin and recovery was attributed to Squadron Leader Brooke. This was also in England at Killingholme, and he deliberately entered a spin and then recovered from it using Park's technique, which was developed just 3 years before. So these very first documented examples of the spin and how it was beginning to be understood as a dangerous situation, and therefore pilots were trying to find the best and most corrective spin recovery techniques, are very important in the history of this particular avenue of research. But at this time, the complex dynamics aerodynamically were not really very well understood, and aircraft were not necessarily designed for adequate spin recovery as they are today. And by all documents, the behavior of these very early aircraft were very unpredictable and, quite frankly, dangerous. And as pilots began to investigate the spin, many aircraft were lost, as well as a number of very experienced pilots. So it was a very dangerous time and a very experimental time for aviation research. So probably as a reaction to this, a number of theoreticians and mathematicians were looking at developing mathematical models and scale model testing in order to kind of correlate what the pilots were seeing in the air. And also at this time they were beginning to understand that it was mainly the tail section of the aircraft and its design which allowed sufficient recovery from the spin, and what it was that gave an aircraft good or bad spin behavior. So as an example of that, some experiments on a BAT Bantam fighter led to the publication of two extensive ARC reports by Irving. And this particular aircraft had a reputation for entering a flat spin, again a very dangerous situation to be in. So Irving's work was in direct response to this, and he found that, and it's the first documented use of the term, that a flat spin was characterized by a very fast rotation rate, approximately 1 spin per second, and a radius of only a few feet, and it was described as almost impossible to recover from.